December 15th, 1966. The world stopped. Walt Disney, the man who had successfully commodified the human imagination, was dead. But the tragedy wasn't his passing. It was what remained. For 18 years, the Walt Disney Company became a ghost ship. It was run by the Vestiges, a board of directors who asked one question before every decision. What would Walt have done? It was a mantra that turned a creative powerhouse into a museum. By 1984, the dust wasn't just on the shelves. It was in the balance sheets the stock had created. The animation studio, the very heart of the empire, was producing flops like The Black Cauldron, a film so dark and expensive it nearly suffocated the studio. Disney was no longer a kingdom. It was a 40-square-mile piece of real estate in Florida with a target on its back. Enter the raiders. Saul Steinberg, a corporate titan with a reputation for dismembering companies, saw Disney as a carcass. He didn't care about Mickey. He cared about the land. He launched a hostile takeover, a green mill attack that threatened to sell the studio off in pieces. To save the company, the board had to commit the ultimate sin. They had to bring in outsiders. They didn't just need managers. They needed mercenaries. Michael Eisner came from Paramount. He was the golden boy, a man who understood the high-concept blockbuster. But he was erratic, prone to fits of ego. To balance him, they hired Frank Wells, a mountain climber and a legal genius. Wells was the only man on Earth who knew how to tame Einer's fire without getting burned. But there was a third man, a man Michael Eisner brought with him as his shadow. Jeffrey Katzenberg. Jeffrey was 33 years old. He didn't sleep. He didn't have hobbies. He had the work at Paramount. They called him the Golden Retriever because he would find any script, any talent, any deal. At Disney, he was given the impossible task: fix the animation department. The old guard animators hated him. They were the 9 old men's disciples, and here was this suit telling them how to draw. Katzenberg moved them out of the beautiful Burbank lot and into a windowless warehouse in Glendale. It was nicknamed the Ghetto, but Jeffrey knew something they didn't. Pressure creates diamonds. He began a gilded revolution. He implemented gong shows where any employee, from a janitor to a director, could pitch an idea. If it was bad, they got the gong. If it was good, it became a legend. In 1989, the world saw the first glimmer of the Gilded Truth. The Little Mermaid wasn't just a movie. It was a declaration of war against the skeptics. It made $200 million. Suddenly, the zombie kingdom was breathing again. The resurrection was complete. The stock was up. The parks were full. The animation was magic again. But in the halls of the Magic Kingdom, a new question was being whispered. If Michael was the architect and Jeffrey was the engine, who actually owned the soul of the company? Success is the greatest mask for hatred. And as part 2 of the video begins, the mask is about to slip. Because while they were celebrating their golden era, the peacekeeper Frank Wells was looking at his watch. His time was running out. Up next, the Great Schism. By 1992, Michael Eisner felt invincible. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a cultural monarch. He had moved from the boardroom to the TV screen, hosting the wonderful world of Disney, stepping into the shoes of Walt himself. But the gilded truth of leadership is that the higher you climb, the thinner the air becomes. Disney was expanding at a rate that defied physics. They bought the Anaheim Angels. They started a cruise line. They were building Euro Disney, a multi-billion-dollar bet on European soil. But Jeffrey Katzenberg, the workhorse, was growing tired of the shadow. He was the one delivering Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin. He was the one turning hand-drawn sketches into billions of dollars in merchandise. The only reason the empire hadn't imploded was Frank Wells. If Eisner was the ego and Katzenberg was the libido, Wells was the superego. He was the bridge. He would spend his mornings on the phone with Michael, massaging his insecurities, and his afternoons with Jeffrey, tempering his frantic ambition. Wells was the peacekeeper. He held the contracts. He held the secrets, and most importantly, he held the succession plan. Jeffrey believed that when Frank eventually retired to climb the world's highest peaks, his true passion, the number 2 spot, would be his. It was a silent agreement, a gilded promise. Easter Sunday, 1994. The peacekeeper was gone. Frank Wells died in a helicopter crash in the Ruby Mountains. The tragedy was profound, but in a cold world of corporate warfare, it was a vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum. Within 48 hours of the funeral, before the dirt had even settled on Frank's grave, the Civil War began. Jeffrey Katzenberg walked into Michael Eisner's office. He didn't offer condolences. He offered an ultimatum. I want Frank's job. I want to be president of the Walt Disney Company now." Einer's reaction wasn't just a no. It was a visceral rejection. To Michael, Jeffrey was a small man, a loyal soldier who had forgotten his place. Einer didn't want a partner. He wanted a subordinate. He looked at the man who had delivered the Disney Renaissance and saw a threat. He began to freeze him out. Meetings happened without Jeffrey. Memos were lost. The architect was dismantling his own engine. In August 1994, Jeffrey Katzenberg walked out of the Magic Kingdom for the last time. But he didn't go quietly. He took his Rolodex, he took his rage, and he took a billionaire named Steven Spielberg with him. The Civil War had moved from the boardroom to the box office, and Jeffrey Katzenberg was about to prove that a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous predator in Hollywood. Up next, The Revenge of the Prodigy. On October 12, 1994, less than 2 months after his exile, Jeffrey Katzenberg stood on a stage and announced the birth of DreamWorks SKG. It was the first new major studio in Hollywood in 60 years, but to Michael Eisner, it wasn't a business venture. It was a declaration of war. Katzenberg didn't just want to compete, he wanted to eviscerate. He knew Disney's playbook because he had written most of it. He began a talent drain, poaching Disney's top animators with promises of equity and freedom. He was building our anti-Disney, a place where the suits didn't dictate the art. While building his new empire, Jeffrey launched a legal tactical strike. He sued Disney for $250 million in unpaid bonuses, the 2% of all profits. He claimed he was promised by the late Frank Wells. The trial was a PR disaster for the Magic Kingdom. It forced Michael Eisner into a deposition where he famously admitted under oath that he hated Jeffrey Katzenberg. The gilded mask was gone. The world saw the CEO of the world's most wholesome company acting like a scorned mob boss. Disney eventually settled for an undisclosed amount, rumored to be near the full $250 million. Jeffrey didn't need the money. He used it as fuel for his revenge. This was the petty era. When Katzenberg learned that Disney-owned Pixar was making a movie about ants, he fast-tracked his own version. He offered the director of A Bug's Life, John Lasseter, a deal to stop production. When that failed, he scheduled Ants to release just weeks before Disney's film. This move inadvertently created a new enemy for Eisner, Steve Jobs. Jobs, then CEO of Pixar, was furious. He saw Eisner's inability to control Katzenberg as a weakness. The Civil War was no longer a two-front war. It was becoming a multi-dimensional conflict that would eventually lead to Disney's greatest existential threat, the loss of Pixar itself. In 2001, Katzenberg delivered his masterpiece of spite, Shrek. It wasn't just a movie. It was a 90-minute satirical assault on Michael Eisner and the Disney brand. Farquaad lived in a perfect plastic kingdom that looked suspiciously like a Disney theme park. He obsessed over perfection while being morally bankrupt. When Shrek won the first ever Academy Award for Best Animated Feature, beating Disney's Monsters, Inc., the humiliation was complete. But while Jeffrey was laughing from his new throne, the gilded cracks at Disney were turning into canyons. Michael Eisner was winning the battles, but he was losing the war for the soul of his company, and a new shadow was forming not from an outsider, but from the family itself. While Michael Eisner fought Jeffrey Katzenberg in the headlines, a much quieter storm was brewing in the shadows of the Disney family tree. Roy Disney, the nephew of Walt and the son of the man who co-founded the empire, had been the silent shareholder for decades. Roy was the keeper of the flame. To the world, he was a figurehead. To Eisner, he was an annoyance, a distraction from the modern business of media conglomerates. But Roy saw what the spreadsheets didn't show. He saw the gilded truth. Under Eisner's increasingly erratic reign, the Disney magic had become a commodity. The parks were under-maintained, the movies were losing their heart, and most importantly, the partnership with Pixar was about to die. The early 2000s were a graveyard of Disney ambition. While DreamWorks was winning Oscars and Pixar was dominating the box office with Finding Nemo, Disney's in-house animation was hemorrhaging money. Eisner's relationship with Steve Jobs had completely disintegrated. Jobs famously called the Disney board clueless. Eisner responded by preparing to build Circle 7 Animation, a studio designed specifically to make sequels to Pixar films without Pixar's involvement. It was the ultimate fuck you to the creative community. Roy Disney had seen enough. In late 2003, Eisner utilized a mandatory retirement age rule to force Roy off the board. It was a move intended to silence the last of the Disneys. Instead, it gave Roy the one thing a revolutionary needs: exile. Roy Disney didn't go to the press. He went to the people. He launched SafeDisney.com. It was the first time in history a corporate coup was organized via the internet. He painted Eisner as a vandal at the gates of his uncle's kingdom. He traveled the country, meeting with pension fund managers and individual shareholders. He wasn't asking for money. He was asking for a vote of no confidence. He was stripped of his office, but he had the moral high ground. He was a Disney fighting for Disney. The 2004 annual shareholders meeting. Michael Eisner stood on stage, expecting a routine re-election. But when the votes were tallied, the Gilded Empire shook to its core. 43% of shareholders refused to vote for Eisner's re-election to the board. It was a staggering, unprecedented rebuke. In the world of corporate governance, a 10% protest is a warning. A 43% protest is a guillotine. The board had no choice. That night, they stripped Eisner of his chairmanship. He remained CEO, but he was a lame duck king. The Civil War was entering its final, most treacherous phase. The architect was still in the building, but the walls were closing in. Up next, the silent succession. By late 2004, Michael Eisner was a king without a country. He still held the title of CEO, but the 43% vote had turned his office into a glass cage. Every move he made was scrutinized by a board that was now terrified of their own shareholders. The architect who had saved Disney from the Raiders in '84 was now being treated like the very intruder he once repelled. But Eisner had one final move. He wanted to pick his successor. He wanted a mini Michael, someone who would protect his legacy. He looked at his number two, Abijah. To Eisner, Abijah was the safe choice, a polished corporate diplomat who wouldn't rock the boat. It was the last mistake the architect would ever make. Abijah knew that to save the kingdom, he had to kill the king, not with a dagger, but with a handshake. While Eisner spent his final months fighting petty battles, Abijah was on a secret apology tour. Abijah called Steve Jobs. He didn't lead with a contract. He led with an admission. We messed up. He sat in Jobs' kitchen and listened to him vent about Eisner for hours. He did the same with Roy Disney. He wasn't just fixing business relationships. He was performing an exorcism. He was removing the Eisner ego from the Disney brand. On September 30, 2005, Michael Eisner walked out of the Disney lot for the last time. There were no statues erected in his honor that day. No grand parades. Only the silence of a man who had stayed too long at the party. Bob Iger's Disney was more profitable than Walt or Michael could have ever imagined. He turned the zombie kingdom into a global hegemon, but at what cost? The Civil War was over, but in its place came a gilded monopoly. The creative risks of the 90s were replaced by the algorithm of the franchise. We tell ourselves that Disney is about magic, but the gilded truth is that the Magic Kingdom is, and always has been, a battlefield. The Civil War of the 90s didn't just change a CEO, it changed how we consume imagination. It taught us that in the world of high-stakes art, the truth is often the first thing to be gilded in gold and sold back to us. Michael Eisner once said, "To be successful, you have to be at least a little bit of a tyrant." He was right, but he forgot the second half of the rule. Every tyrant eventually meets his nephew.